This video is for reading 59. It's entitled It's Getting Better, Queer Hope, Queer Courage, and it's written by Jean Halley and Amy Eshelman. So this reading begins by the authors deciding to start the reading with an excerpt that describes an 8-year-old boy at a pride march. They're discussing, the journalist was talking about the little boy and his experience at Pride with his mother. And, just to kind of highlight this, um, the excerpt says, he is a shy boy who is self conscious about his missing teeth when he smiles and very intelligent. He doesn't like school because he gets bullied, but he does well academically. We do our best to stop the bullying and involve the LGBT services at his school. We keep him involved in the LGBT community because we believe that by speaking to other people who were like him when they were his age, reinforces that he is of value and that his life as he wants to live it is okay. Um, so, just in this excerpt, and, I think it kind of becomes clear why the authors chose to start their reading this way. And that's because although being a sexual minority is clearly still a subordinate status in society, it comes with discriminations and prejudices from the larger public. There's still a certain amount of stigma that exists with being a member of that community. And this stigma can be more or less depending on exactly, where you are in the country and, are you in an urban or suburban or rural area? Um, but what the authors note is even though we haven't reached, this point where sexual minorities, don't necessarily have this subordinate status, it has gotten better. And they emphasize, that the treatment of the LGBT community, but particularly maybe the LGB, even more so, has really changed in just this child's lifetime. And they kind of gloss over, all since this child has been born. We went from only having one state that allowed lesbian and gay couples to legally marry, because DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, was kind of in full effect at the time he was born, to where we are now, where the constitutional right of people to marry people, regardless of their partner's sex or gender identity, has been upheld by the Supreme Court. It's the law of the land. And so even though I've gone over this material before, I just kind of want to highlight, some things about this progress. As we moved from DOMA to the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges. So in 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed, and it basically defined marriage as being between a man and a woman. And because nobody was even really talking about transgender individuals at that time, it definitely was focused on cisgender men and women. And so this was largely the law of the land. There were a couple of cities and, states that began to allow people to marry people of the same sex, or to offer them the opportunity to have civil unions, if not a marriage. But really for like the next 10, 12 years, DOMA was kind of the dominant, policy. It was law of land. In 2009, a year after he took office, President Obama declared DOMA unconstitutional. And because whoever is the president at that time largely has control over the Department of Justice, he said, the DOJ is not going to defend it in court anymore. And so what then that led to was in, a lot of individual states, same-sex couples and their allies began to file court cases, pushing back against state laws and state restrictions that prevented them from getting married, because they felt confident that if these cases went to federal court, they no longer had to worry about a presidential, administration, taking up these cases, taking a position against them. In 2013, the Supreme Court basically strikes down DOMA. They declare it unconstitutional, so it no longer gets to stand as being, judicial precedent. And so within that next year, even though same-sex marriage is still prohibited in 13 states, at this point it's now permitted in 17 states, as well as the District of Columbia. But whenever you have something as fundamental as marriage rights and the recognition of people's marriages, you know this really can't differ from state to state, because in the US people move all the time, and so just imagine all of the stress, the headache, the court cases involved when people who were in same-sex marriages would move for work related reasons, family related reasons, whatever, to states that their marriages are now no longer recognized within that state. So, unsurprisingly, the Supreme Court had to go back and like revisit this issue. And in 2015, in the case Oberfeld v. Hodges, they basically said states had to allow same sex couples to marry. They recognized it as a constitutional right, similar to how they recognize, interracial marriage, the right to marry someone, regardless of their race. That was, recognized in Loving v. Virginia back in the 1960s. And they said, they had to allow them, the right to marry in their state, and they had to recognize marriages that happened in other states. And so at that time, there were about 390,000 same sex married couples in the US, but there were 1.2 million adults who were living in same sex domestic partnerships. So after that ruling, of course, we saw an uptick in same sex marriages. And now same sex marriage is legal in 26 countries, or a few years ago when I made these slides. So perhaps it's changed a little bit since then. So, this is the world that that young boy, just in his short lifetime, this is how much it has changed. And so although this reading does, it kind of addresses how did the country respond, to these changes? How is the country responding, to this progress? And although, they do highlight, the anti-queer conservative perspective, largely by quoting Ken Paxton, who at that time was the Attorney General of Texas, you basically said, that this, that the Supreme Court ruling diluted marriage, and he encouraged, marriage clerks that even though they legally, had to uphold people's right to marry, he basically was like, we will support, clerks that refuse marriage license to same-sex couples on the basis of their religious beliefs, and there were some clerks who did that, and those cases also made their way through the court system. But ultimately, after the Supreme Court decision, same sex marriage became more acceptable. It became, if not normative, at least more common and more visible. And so this reading, doesn't really highlight, the people who are critical and against LGBT progress so much as it focuses on stories of queer hope and courage, thus the title. And I'm not going to go over all these individual stories. Some of them were individuals like Pauline Parks, Heather Jams, Q Daly, Georgia Brooke Guinan, or I probably did not say that last name correctly. And then some of the stories related more to institutions, for instance, the New York City school system. I encourage you to, read those stories and those details and really think about, in what ways do those stories reflect the hope and the courage that, that civil rights and progress towards acceptance and equality is being made for people of the LGBT community. Beyond the individuals and institutions discussed in this reading, the reading also highlights other, shifts, cultural shifts, societal shifts that they label as being hopeful and courageous. So some of those were, the acknowledgement of female masturbation and really just female sexuality in general. And female sexuality starting to be discussed, whether it's in mainstream media, whether it's in stand-up comedy, whether it's in magazine and articles, but it's starting to be discussed in ways that male sexuality has from for ages. Another hopeful shift is the potential of social media for activism. While the authors do note that social media can, be an awful place at times, right? It's where bullying and harassment, trolling, doxing, all those types of things do occur, but it also has the potential to inspire and allow inspire activism and allow activists to connect. And in addition, of course, it also has the ability to truly teach and inform people about other people's lived experiences and about phenomena that they themselves may not experience, or that they experience but don't realize, is really normal and isn't unique to them. For example, the woman that discussed thinking that, she was strange because of her masturbation. One thing that gets highlighted in this section is the It Gets Better project, which was started in 2010 by activists Dan Savage and Terry Miller. As a response to reports of students that committed suicide after bullying. Oftentimes, that bullying was based upon assumptions that the target was queer. And that's actually where, the reading kind of emulates that project in its title, right? Because the title of this reading is It's Getting Better. And so, if you've never heard of that project before, I encourage you to learn a little bit more about it. Um, and another kind of hopeful shift that was highlighted, although I have some updated information that's less hopeful, is that, Obama, passed executive orders that protected, or basically protected employees on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. It protected them from being discriminated against, if they were federally employees or if they were working for contractors who had, federal contracts. And it's, worth noting, though, that this executive order was rescinded by President Trump in 2017. So, one hand giveth and the other hand taketh away. And so perhaps it was with some amount of foresight, because the authors wrote this, before the Trump administration, before the executive order was rescinded, obviously. But they noted even then that this wasn't enough. And their reasons for it is because, okay, it was really only applicable to people in federal employment or who worked for federal contractors. It didn't really cover people in private employment. And they noted that there is a lot of employment discrimination that is geared towards people of the queer community. And that, oftentimes, some members of the queer community, especially if combined with, being racial or gender minorities, have very high rates of poverty. And so they talk about how, this country would benefit from just what they call guaranteed basic income. And you might have heard this referred to as UBI before, which is universal basic income. But basically, it's just the idea that in the same way that, we provide, free public education, this idea that we kind of provide just kind of a minimum amount of financial assistance so that people are kind of guaranteed that they won't fall below that line. The reading concludes with the authors expressing hope for queer youth, like the boy that they introduced at the reading outset, that they are going to live in a world where things, are getting better, and that they are going to have opportunities to be treated as equals and as full citizens, in this country as they reach adulthood. So, the question I encourage you to consider based on the reading is that the authors in this reading with optimism and hope for the continued progress of the LGBTQ community. Given it has been roughly 5 years since this was written, how would you characterize that optimism? Was it misplaced? Did it play out that way? Was it warranted? In what ways have the LGBTQ community progressed, and in what ways are they still perhaps disenfranchised slash stigmatized?